Hello and welcome back to the Arcane Forge, and welcome back to another Monster Monday, a series where I draw a creature from D&D and I talk about its lore and mythology and what it's like to fight in-game as well. In these videos, I like to use your suggestions for monsters that you would like to see me draw and hear me talk about, and then my patrons over on Patreon vote for which ones of your suggestions they like so much that they'd like to see it next. So if you have a monster you'd like to hear me cover and see my illustration of, make sure to leave that down below in the comments section, and I'll leave a handy dandy link somewhere here to my Patreon as well if you'd like to get involved in the voting process and pick which videos come out in what order. In the meantime though, today's topic is going to be about fire giants, hence why I've dressed in this incendiary ensemble. And this monster was first suggested by Nathan Kavanagh all the way back on my Rakshasa video, which has definitely got to be a couple of years now. So thank you so much for your patience, Nathan, and thank you so much for watching. So let's get started with today's video. Fire giants in D&D are a peculiar breed among their kin. Like other giants, they are huge, averaging around 20 feet tall humanoid creatures. Just like other beings of the giant caste system, known as the Ordning, their appearance is somewhat infused with the element and environment that they're said to command or thrive in, granting them ashen white, coal black, sooty grey or burning red skin, and traditionally sporting hair in shades of red, amber and other colours that would be at home in a fiery colour palette. Unlike the majority of other giant kind, however, who could more or less be described as roughly human in proportion aside from their massive scale, fire giants in D&D at least have always been compared to dwarves in their gait and physique, boasting a heavier top half, broad shoulders, strong, thick arms and necks, with comparatively smaller legs and feet. Just like dwarves, they're excellent miners and smiths, being the masters of metallurgy and gem cutting among their brothers and sisters. I'm not honestly sure why they resemble dwarves so clearly, but there must be some kind of biological niche that tunnelers in D&D evolve into or are created to form. Maybe being comparatively squat in silhouette next to the more gangly species allows for greater survivability in tunnels and excavations, but then surely this is probably negated by their enormous stature. In D&D lore and mythology, when Anam, the All-Father of giant kind, created his progeny, he laid out a strict caste system, which not only structured all of giant kind into a social hierarchy, but also rigidly placed each subspecies of giant into a role. They all have some kind of function to serve within this ordning. For fire giants, as one would expect from my previous description, their role was, and to them still is, to be the smiths of giant kind, providing those they deem to be their superiors, the cloud or storm giants, with arms and armour, and providing weaponry for those who would do battle on behalf of giant kind, namely the frost giants and those lower in the ordning who might throw their lives away in the ancient battles with dragon kind for which giants were basically created. Fire giants, more so than other giants in the ordning for the most part, hold firm to the purpose for which they were created. They believe that some final battle is coming one day in their imperceptibly long lives, and that they and all of giant kind must be ready for it, so they continue to dig and mine, smelt and forge armour and weapons. They're comparable in intelligence to humans on average, but have very limited imagination for ingenuity and new ideas. Apparently aside from the fire giant who invented plate-armoured boots. We're told in Volo's Guide to Monsters that the fire giants became tired and bored of people using caltrops to wound their feet and bring them low in combat, so they created plate-armoured boots to circumvent this. But aside from this, fire giants rely heavily on tradition. They, being similar in behaviour and lifestyle to dwarves, would seem like a good candidate for a society of engineers and tinkers, but they hold so fast to their purpose for which they were created, and their place in the ordning, that they dare not stray from it. So they're excellent crafters of weapons, armour, and also to some extent structural infrastructure. They like buildings. And while there's no time for sort of art or really sculpture in their culture, they do build elaborate and illustrious halls, perhaps for other giants, or their mines might be more like the mines of Moria, for example. Their art and expressiveness goes into the things that they build, that have both function and artistry. But they don't have the minds, or perhaps the desire, to explore engineering and the development of complex mechanisms. As a result of this closed-mindedness, they are pretty poor tacticians. They are very useful on the battlefield, but lack direction and forethought, being almost purely reactive never trying to predict an opponent's attacks or tactics, instead guarding against them or trying to strike once provoked. In the ancient times of the Dragon Wars, fire giants were given instructions by cloud and storm giants on how best to utilize their armies in combat, and they view this as the job of these same beings today, as part of the ordning. They believe that it would be disrespectful or even perhaps blasphemous of their people to invest time in thinking about such endeavors, so they stagnate in their own combat mediocrity for the sake of peer pressure from their ancestors. Now, while battle planning and combat maneuvers may not be their strength, they are certainly no slouch when it comes to combat. They forge some of the greatest armor and weapons around, and due to their size, their breastplates can be as thick as the walls of a tavern, all smelted from steel, titanium, or whatever other metals they manage to mine or combine. The average fire giant has an armor class of 18, for example, and their time spent mining and working the anvils of their great molten halls has left them with 25 strength and 23 constitution. Their greatsword attacks deal a staggering 6d6 plus 7 slashing damage, and they get to make 2 of these per turn in a multi-attack, which must feel like being struck by a sharpened girder the size of a small truck. Volo's Guide also gifts DMs with some specialized tactical units for each of the giant casts, and in the case of fire giants, we have the terrifying Dreadnought. These brutes opt to relieve themselves of their swords in favor of wielding 2 enormous, blazing tower shields covered in spikes and blades. Their 2 massive shields are accounted for in their armor class, which is a horrifying 21. But if they wish to hurl a rock, which all giants are wont to do, they must temporarily stow or drop one of these massive wall-like shields, temporarily lowering their armor class. All giants, as a reference to The Hobbit, have a rock-throwing ability. The fire giant Dreadnought is no exception, hurling a 4d10 plus 8 molten lump of rock. And they have a terrifying fire shield attack, where they bash people with one of their fire shields. Unsurprisingly, having 2 of these weapons, they get to make a multi-attack with 2 of these attacks. Each one deals 4d6 plus 8 bludgeoning damage, a further 2d6 fire damage, and 2d6 piercing damage, making this one of the most horrifying attacks, covering so many different bases of different types of damage, all stacking together to be a horrifying attack. Having 2 of these shields crash down upon you seems like it would flatten, pierce, and burn almost anyone. So as a DM, knowing that these creatures are not particularly strong at tactics, it might be a good idea for them to hit multiple opponents with these attacks to show their flawed judgment. Additionally, however, they have an ability called Shield Charge, where they force both of these shields together and, like a train, run with these cowcatcher-like shields in front of them, moving up to 30 feet in a straight line, moving through the space of any creature smaller than huge, i.e. the height of this creature. We're told that the first time that the fire giant enters a creature's space during this move, it can make a fire shield attack against that creature, and if the attack hits, the target also needs to succeed on a strength saving throw or be pushed ahead of the giant for the rest of this 30-foot movement. And if a creature fails the save by 5 or more, it is knocked prone and is crushed underneath the weight of this shield and bludgeoned by the stomping feet of this giant, taking an additional 3d6 plus 8 bludgeoning damage, or 6d6 plus 8 bludgeoning damage if the creature was already prone. The burning pain train approaches. Now, it's important to note that while engineering and mechanisms aren't these creatures' strengths, I say that, they still have things like pulleys and minecarts, perhaps even something akin to a steam train. Maybe that is too technologically advanced. But these shields certainly are emblazoned with fire magic. Giant kind tend not to explore the study of the arcane, as traditional spellcasters, like the mortal player races of the game, tend to, but fire giants have a mastery over fire, specifically through fire sorcery and, in particular, rune magic, which they use to better bend metals to their will or infuse their creations with incendiary power. Their magnificent arms and armor are not easily traded with outsiders though, so don't get your hopes up of wishing for a fire giant dagger the size of a lance to burn and slice your enemies in half. They are lawful evil creatures, and while they're known to barter with spellcasters who might summon fire elementals to stoke the fires of their forges, for example, they would prefer instead to capture and enslave any wandering adventurers they come across. Indeed, the fire giant slave colonies are vast and cruel, as they often claim many hundreds of lives into servitude so that they have workers to toil away on their assembly lines, to fan the flames of their forges, or to carry the ores and minerals that they claim from their massive mines. Like most forms of giants, fire giants in D&D as we know them have their roots in Norse mythology, where the Jotun of Muspelheim, a land likely to mean the land of world destroyers, an approximation taken from the Old Norse Munnspili, meaning world splitter, the burning land of the south, which melts the everfrost of the north, with its incalculable heat, dwell and await Ragnarok, the end of the world, in which they will play a significant part. Muspelheim is a terrifying molten land of perpetual flame, but also of beauty. The sparks and cinders of Muspelheim shoot off into the great dark void, Ginnungagap, and settle into motes of light that we know as the sun, moon, and stars. The guardian, and often seen as the leader of the fire giants, is known as Surt or Surtur, depending on how you prefer to pronounce it. And to the Norse people, this name meant the swarthy one, or the blackened one, the charred one, whose skin is scorched by the flames of Muspelheim. He who carries what is known as the bright sword, which he will use to slay the god Freyr, the god of kingship and peace, after which his flames will engulf the world, contributing to the end of reality, known as Ragnarok. Interestingly, D&D's fire giants also have a guardian or ruler known as Surtur, who is considered some kind of god, a child directly of the Allfather Anam, his cleansing flames burning away the impurities and leave only those strong enough to be tempered and strengthened by the forging of his holy fire. But I really enjoyed today's video, and I hope you did too. If you did, please make sure to leave a little like down below, and let me know how you used fire giants in your campaigns. They seem like one of the most easily accessible ones to me. Perhaps players could try and trade some of their massive weapons and armor, or encounter them in the deep, instead of immediately reaching for the dragon encounter that you might find underground. If you love this illustration and you'd like a copy for yourself, I'd urge you to head over to my Patreon page if you want to support the channel in a very, very significant way. Then everything from the price of a cup of coffee all the way up to the very highest levels really, really helps this channel and helps me to keep making these videos for you. But on top of that, at the Monster Monday pledge level, you get a copy of every single illustration that I do each month, including this one, which you can use to haunt your players if you plan to throw a deadly fire giant at them. Otherwise, I hope you'll subscribe so that you don't miss a video from me, and to let YouTube know if I'm doing a good job. But in the meantime, if you see something in the distance that looks like a friendly dwarf when you're mining in the depths, just make sure to check what the temperature's like, because when they get closer, you might realize that it's maybe a fire giant instead, and you'll want to keep your distance to avoid being captured or smeared on the ground by one of those massive shields. And until next time, happy monster hunting.